This is an intro to web dev. I'm going to kind of show you guys how to build your own online portfolio from scratch. So this is an overview of what we're going to go over today. Why do you want to build an online portfolio? What about it? What is HTML, CSS, JS? And finally, we're going to spend the rest of the workshop just making one. So let's start off with what is an online portfolio and what are the benefits of having an online presence. So online portfolios are basically, if you were to Google software engineering portfolio or front-end developer portfolio or back-end developer portfolio, anything tech portfolio, you're going to see a series of things pop up in your Google results. And they're all just going to be portfolios. And portfolios are actually extremely popular for engineers because it's literally a way for you to work on your front-end development skills by building a website and also have a place that's basically a virtual resume. So it's a great first step into web development, especially for beginners, and you want to kind of build something, you've never built something before. A portfolio is always a great response because you're literally building something from scratch and you have a place to put projects and your hobbies, work, volunteering, skills, like all of this different stuff that you want to put. It literally could just emulate a resume as well. But these are all things that you could have on your online portfolio. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword. It allows you to work on your front-end skills and also provides you a place to show your work that you've done in the past and in the future. And let's look a little bit at our tech stack. So here's the thing. The world of web is made up of these three languages, like it legitimately is. HTML, if you guys don't know, it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. That's the code that creates the website. It's literally the code that you're writing out, and it has the content, the words on a website. It literally has the content and information of every single website in the world. And then CSS, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. This is the code that beautifies your website. So you can have HTML on its own, but it's going to look very ugly in black and white, and you guys will see that later. But when you add CSS, that's when you have white space, and you have coloring, and you have styles and typography. Everything that makes your website look visually appealing, that's what CSS does for you. And JavaScript is the part of code that literally helps you add functionality to your website. You can have a website with no JavaScript if you don't want to, but it is very difficult. And it's actually better if you just use JavaScript to make things functional on your website. It's a more modernized language. So these three languages together are power horses. They literally make up the world of web dev. And I do want to mention really quick, some people say, okay, well, what is JSX? If you don't know what that is, that's okay. It stands for JavaScript XML. And this is the language that frameworks like React.js use, which is a workshop that's actually going to be at 12 a.m. with Eli if you guys want to know what React.js is. But JSX, it's extremely popular. And the reason is it's because it's basically a merge between HTML and JS. So they kind of blended these two languages together to create JSX, which makes perfect sense because HTML on its own, it's code that's creating the website. JS is creating the functionality of the website. When you merge them together, you're automatically just writing code that both creates and adds functionality to your website. So JSX is also very powerful, and it's used in a lot of modern front-end framework technologies. But what I'm going to go over in this workshop is mostly HTML and CSS, because the core of JSX is HTML. The core of web dev is HTML. The core of styling is CSS. It's very important to have a strong understanding of the base of what you're building on so that it makes more sense when you go into these higher level complex languages. Okay. So that was literally it for the presentation, because now we are going to go into actual development. Okay, so I kind of wish I could see the chat while I share my screen. Let's see, share. Oh, I think I know what I can do. Yeah, let's just share screen. Okay, so here's how we're gonna do this. I think the first thing that I wanna go over is this little UI that I made for this workshop specifically. I actually made multiple pages here, but because of the length of this workshop, I already know I'm only gonna have time to complete just one page with you guys. So this was a home page that I was thinking of. And it's very simple. It just shows your name at the top left, and it shows some social media icons on the top right. In the middle, it says hello or whatever greeting you would like to have. And then there's a few buttons in the middle. I have project, work, and hobbies. So this is the end goal of our project today. This is what I'm going to hope to be able to finish with you guys in the next 52 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing that I want to do, okay, let me just go ahead and open up my IDE. So basically, if you have an IDE on your computer, go ahead and open it up. It's a text editor. But if you don't, then I would say, go ahead and download one later on, because an IDE is essentially where you write all of your code. This is where you can write any of the code that you want to run on your local host. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay, because you're also going to see that later. But I already have this project up and open. I'm going to actually just do this from bare bones scratch so you guys can literally follow along with me from the bare basics. But if you have an IDE, go ahead and open it up. An IDE is just a text editor. I'm using Atom. Some people use Sublime. Some people use VS Code. There's a lot of different ways of writing this out there. All right, so let me go ahead and open up my notes. Okay, so I wish I could see the chat. I'm sorry that I can't, but I'm going to go ahead and lowercase this, open up my terminal. So here's the two things that we're going to be using for this workshop today. I'm going to be using my terminal, and for some of you guys on Windows, that may be your command prompt or your WSL. But for those of you on Mac, it is literally your terminal. If you go to like your applications and type in terminal, you'll find it. Your terminal is basically where you can run. Okay, so basically we have files that are code. It's like .html files. If you're writing Python, then you have Python files, .java files. If you're writing Java, from your terminal, that's where you can run these files. And for us, we're running .html files, and we want to see these files actually show up in our browser. So in order to do that, I actually have a link to share with you guys. Let me go ahead and go back here. Some people use Vim. That's true. Atom is amazing. I love Atom the most, but some people definitely do use Vim. So the link that I just shared with you guys, let me see if I can open it up. It's this right here. So in order to run an HTML page on your local host, you just have to run a couple commands. There's a few ways to do this. The way that I'm going to do it is by using Python. So I'm going to be running python-m simple HTTP server, which basically means, hey, I'm going to run this local port for you. You can also do this by using PHP, don't do that, or you can use Node.js to run it. But for what I'm going to do today, I'm going to be using Python just because it's way simpler to run it this way. So let me go ahead and copy this. I'm going to, I think actually, yeah, let me switch directories. Projects, layouts. All right, KH portfolio. All right, so now I'm in the directory and I'm gonna literally delete all of this CSS that we're gonna do together. It's okay. All right, so what I want to do is going to paste python-m simple server. Let me make it bigger for y'all. It's going to say it's serving an HTTP on this port 8000, which basically means I can just go to localhost 8000 and see this. It's basically saying there's nothing there. Let me go into pages directory. Here we go. Okay, so we're looking at this HTML file. And what we're looking at is actually the very bare bones structure of any HTML file. You have to follow this format for any HTML file to actually be considered an HTML file. So the first thing is saying doc type HTML. Second thing, this could just be HTML on its own, but it's always good to specify the language that you're writing your code in. So that's why we just have lang and then it equals en, which is the English language code. In every HTML file, there are head tags. Within these head tags, that's kind of where you put your metadata for your website, you put the title of your website, you put scripts to JavaScript, you can put links to your CSS in this head. And the body is where literally everything that correlates to your website exists. So we could literally just write anything in here. I'm going to go ahead and I want to restart my localhost clear. no HTTP simple server. If we go here and we refresh, wait, why isn't this loading? Oh, pages. That's because it's in a pages directory. If you were not doing this in any files, it would be fine. But you can kind of see now here, the only thing that shows on my website is just the word blog, because that's what I have in my body. If I were to change this to say something, for example, and refresh it, then it updates and it says something instead. So body is literally where everything on the website exists. This is where all of the content would go. Something that's very important that I want to know before we start putting in information in here in our body is there's multiple different HTML tags that you can use. So head is a tag, for example, body is a tag, for example, and there's many more. There's ones called header, main, footer. There's ones called div, p for paragraph, span. So these are all different ways that you can represent the content that you're writing out. And what I want to do, if we look back at our Figma, we can kind of see that our page is structured in sort of two different ways. This first part up here, I would consider this to be like the header of my website, right? And then this content in the middle, I would say that's like the main content. And if I were to have content down here, then I could consider that the footer of my content. So while these things are required, HTML tag, head, and body, things like footer and main and header and nav, div, these are all optional things that you can also include. But it's literally what you use to write a website. So let's start with making the header. We just want to get just this first part up right here where it says name and we've got some icons. So in order to do that, I'm literally just going to make a div and I'm going to say name. I'm going to close that div. I'm going to make another div and I'm going to say Twitter, Instagram, and GitHub. I'm going to close that div as well. I also want to use my indicative headers and I want to say header and close with header. So now I can kind of see, okay, I have this tag called header and inside of it I have two divs, one called name and another one called Twitter, Instagram, and GitHub. So if I were to refresh this, those things would show up. It's in my body, so of course it's going to show up. It doesn't look very good, but it shows up anyway. And if we look back at our, website, our UI, we have it written in a specific way. We don't want them one on top of the other. We want them right beside each other, on complete opposite sides, actually. This is something HTML cannot do, and this is where CSS comes into play. So if you don't already have one, you can go ahead and make a .css file. Mine is just named index.css because my HTML file is just named index.html. And this is where you'll be able to put any CSS that you want your HTML file to use. So first things first, how do you actually get your HTML file and your CSS file to speak to each other? There's two things that you have to do. The first thing is you have to link your CSS file in your HTML file. So let's go ahead and do that. Where you do that is in your head, because again, you always put links to your scripts and your CSS, you always put those things into your head. So the way that we're going to do that, we're just going to say link rel is equal to style sheet in lowercase s. And we're going to say href index.css. Oh, closing tag. I think that's it. Yeah, so this is basically saying what I'm referencing is a style sheet because CSS is literally cascading style sheets. And then the reference is index.css. So this kind of tells it, oh, okay, if I'm looking for CSS, I need to look in this file. It's called index.css. So in order for us to actually modify the CSS of any of the individual components we've made, we need a way to indicate them. This is kind of where classes and IDs come in. Classes and IDs are hard to explain, and it's better to see visually, so you're going to see it in a second, but I'm going to give a brief explainer anyway. Basically, an ID is something that you can give to anything, like a div, for example, and I could call it whatever I want. So I could say site header name. And that's the ID of this thing right here. Whenever I reference this ID in my CSS, it's going to know to modify just this thing. I can do the same thing for my socials. I could say site header socials. And whenever I reference site header socials as an ID in my CSS, it's going to know to modify just that thing. So I can go ahead and show you guys an example of that. The way that you reference your HTML IDs in CSS is by using a hashtag and then the name of whatever it is. And then within these curly brackets is where you can say whatever you want. So to kind of show you guys that this works, I'm just going to say the name will be blue. And for our site header socials, the color will be red. If we go here and we refresh, it didn't work. Why didn't that work? Wait, no, genuinely, why didn't that work? Hold on. Site color blue, Instagram, not Instagram. Oh, wait a second. We also need our class. Div ID, site header name, site header name. Oh, wait a second. Let's do classes instead. Wait, is this running? Oh my God, why is this not working? Wait a second. Site header name. Oh, wait a second. That's why I misspelled ref. It's REL, not REF. Oh my God, that was so stressful. So basically the way that you reference something in your CSS by ID is with this hashtag. And I kind of spoiled it, but the way that if you were to instead use a class, the way that you would reference it is with a dot. So we have a class assigned to header. So I'm going to just say dot and then site header because that's the name that I provided to it. So you can kind of see class, this is called site header. The way that I would reference a class is with the dot. And then if it was an ID, site header name, or ID, site header socials, then I would reference it with a hashtag, site header name, hashtag, site header socials. And you can kind of see that this is how your CSS is able to speak to your HTML. It recognizes the ID on your name and it changes the styling of it to whatever you tell it to. It recognizes the ID on site header socials and it changes the color to whatever I wanted to. If I wanted to add a background color to just my site header name, then I could do that. I could say it's red and it would give me a background red of just that thing. But what we want to focus on right now is kind of forcing our style to not be one on top of the other, but instead be on two opposite sides. And this is where a very important part of CSS comes into play, which is called Flexbox. So I'm going to share this link with you guys. Oh God. Also, let's see. Okay, so the way that you structure things on a website is up to CSS naturally, and it's up to two different things in CSS. One is called Flex and one is called Grid. Flexbox is very popular, so is grid styling, and they can both be used together or you can use them separately. I think Flexbox is a little bit more intuitive, so that's what I'm going to use to explain to you guys, but you can literally use Flexbox for whatever you need to. It really just controls the way that things fall on your website, the structure of your website, and the order of things. So the way that you basically activate it is you have to say display flex or display inline flex. Spoiler tip, inline flex is basically just forcing it to be inline. Flex by itself kind of indicates that they can be separate boxes if you'd like. So the first thing that I want to do is to my class site header, I want to say display flex. So in my code, I'm going to say display flex. The reason that I want to do that is because I want to assign this flex direction of a row. Instead of having them one on top of each other, I want them to be within a row. Now that I've assigned display flex, I can say flex direction row. So let's go ahead and say flex direction row and refresh that and see if it did anything. It did. So that shows that flex direction literally takes, first of all, display flex says, okay, I'm now dealing with a flex box here. I know exactly what CSS property I'm going to be using. When I say flex direction, it's listening for what direction do I want these children to go into. And I tell it to go into a row, so it puts them all in a little row to follow along with. And to kind of get even more insight on this, the way that you can sort of think about it is when you have a class holding certain things, that class is sort of the parent for the children inside of it. That's kind of why it tabs in and over, because these divs are a part of my class. So whatever I assign to this site header right here, these divs are going to follow that because this site header is essentially the parent of my children, name and Twitter. Twitter, Instagram, and GitHub, but they're those two strings. So the next thing that I want to do here, let's see my notes. I want to make sure that they're not so close together. So how can I do that? That's another part of Flex. What you can do with Flex is justify your content. So you can justify the children all start at the beginning or they start all at the end, the center, whatever you want. In our case, we want there to be massive space in between them. And it looks like space between is the best one for us to use here. So I'm going to go ahead and type that out. Justify content, space between. When I do that and I refresh my localhost, I can see that it appropriately gave me space between. So you see how Flex is able to rapidly just help you create these things and add them in and very quickly allow you to move things around. This is very beneficial for a hackathon project, but also for your very first portfolio project, especially when you're trying to understand the basics and essentials of how these things work. Flex is a great way to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove these colors. We have our name and we have Twitter, Instagram, and GitHub. We have them where we want. It doesn't look very pretty at all, but all we're caring about right now is the layout of things. So if we go back to our design on Figma, it looks like the next thing that we want is just this line here. Something that you can do in HTML is called a horizontal line break. And all you have to do for that is literally just call HR. Call HR. And then if you refresh, it literally just gives you a line break. That's exactly what we want. There's nothing wrong with this line here. This looks completely fine. The styling, not very pretty, but again, we're going to get into customizing everything near the end. So we have this line break, and now we can go on to the next part. What's the next thing we want? So it looks like the last part of this project is just hello world and these buttons in the main center. So that's the next thing that we can include. I don't want this to be something that I include in my header. I want it to be the main content of my website. So what I'm going to do is create these two called main, and inside of it, I'll just make one that says hello world, close that div, and then I'm not even going to bother writing out the buttons right now because I have something else that I want to do for that. So instead, I'm just going to say projects, work, and hobbies, close that div. Now, if we refresh this, oh wait, why did it show up here? Header, oh, whoops, I put it above the HR thing. This puts me in between them. Refresh. Okay, so now we have our header content, we have our HR line block, and then we have our main content. Right here, hello world, projects, work, hobbies. Same thing as our name and Twitter, Instagram, GitHub. This is not in the right place. Where we want it to be is in the mid-center. That's exactly where we want it to be. So what we do is we go over to our CSS. Well, first, before we can go to our CSS, we need to assign some classes and some IDs to this. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do to my main, I want to give it a class, and I'm going to name it site main. And I want to give these two individual children their own IDs. ID, site main, greeting is good. And I'm going to give this an ID, site main. I know they're going to be buttons, so I'll call them buttons. That doesn't do anything to our code, by the way. But now we know we have ways to access this information. And I also want to say one more thing real quick. What I do to distinguish between when I want to use a class and when I want to use an ID, when I want to modify one thing on its own specifically, I tend to give it its own ID. When I want to modify a group of things at once, I wrap them with a class. That's kind of why I assign class to things like header and main, because they're kind of parents for the children within them. And I want whatever properties I assign to this class to apply to all of its children. So now that we know that, we can go ahead and go into our CSS and modify the class for site main, and the same thing for main greeting. Before I do that, I actually want to include some subheaders and say header content. This is how you leave comments in CSS, by the way, header content, and then I'm going to do the same for main content, just to make it easier to distinguish between the code that I'm writing. Let's go ahead and say site main. Then we can do the same for our IDs, site main greeting, I think it was. and then site main buttons. All right, so first things first, I want this in the center. It's literally not in the center. What I can do, just like Flex allows me to, I can say I want to use a display of Flex, and I can say where I want it to be, justify content in the center. And there's also more things in here that allows you to justify things in the center, like align items. This allows you to align them on the X and Y axis. And then aligning your content, that's a little bit different, but aligning items is more for children specifically. Aligning content is blocks of information at a time. So what I'm going to use right now is, first of all, I'm going to say display flex. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to give it a flex direction. For this one, I don't want to give it a row because I already know what row does. It puts them on the same exact row. I want Hello World to be on top of projects, works, and hobbies. That's not a row, it's a column because this is one item and then this is another item on top of it. So what I can do here is I can say column. Next thing that I want to do is I want to justify my content to the center. Now, if we refresh this, it literally does nothing. And actually, I'll explain to you the reason why it does nothing after I put in all the rest of the things that you need to make this go in the center. We're also going to do a text align center. We're going to say items align center. And we're also going to give this a min height of 60 VW. Now, if we refresh this, we can see it's in the middle. Why did that happen? So something that we can do that may be able to help explain these a little bit more to you is I'm going to remove these things one by one so you can kind of see what they're all doing. If I were to remove align items, that does nothing. But if I were to remove text align, that stops my text from being aligned in the center. So what is following here is kind of following the hierarchy of what you're telling it to do. So without align items, it does nothing. Without text align, it removes the text from being in the center. If I remove text align, then it just puts it right back in the center and I wouldn't even need text align anyway. If I were to remove justified content, then it doesn't put it in the center of the page. Like it's all of these different things. And another thing that I do want to mention, there are so many different ways to end up with the same exact result when you're writing with CSS, which is part of the reason why people don't actually like it because there's no clear answer on how to do something. There are genuinely many different ways to get the same exact solution with CSS. But what really matters is you just understand the library that you're using. And in our case, Flex, how does it work? What is it recognizing and what is it giving priority to over others? Obviously, justified content has the highest priority and then align items and text align. So you kind of have to play around with it. And that, unfortunately, is the part that people really do not like. Anyway, we're able to get our content in the center, which is exactly what we wanted from our UI designs. And it still looks extremely ugly. But before we get into actually making things look pretty, I want to get into another really big part of CSS, which is margining and padding. A lot of people get very confused by this. So please don't be upset if you get confused by it too, because it is not very intuitive. The basics of margining and padding, I will actually show you by modifying our site header name and site header socials. So the first thing that I want to do here, let's modify, actually I want to modify site header because I want this to apply to both my children, this div and this one. I want it to apply to both my children. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my margining. Let me do top first. So I'm going to say I want margin top to be 2% and I refresh this. Actually, I don't think you guys could see this, so let me make it way bigger. So since I refresh this, you can kind of see that I gave it space right at the top. That's what margining does. When you apply margining to an object, it literally makes space between that object and whatever else is around it. So since I said margin top, it's going to make space between that object and the top of it. It's going to put 5% of space right at the top. If I were to say margin bottom 10% and refresh it, we can see that it gave 10% of margin spacing at the bottom of this element. I don't want it to do that. I think 1% and 2%, 5%. Sorry. So 1% and 2% are pretty good here. It's not that obvious, but it doesn't make it look as cramped anymore. Maybe I can even do 1.5%. So that's just giving a little bit of space, a little bit of wiggle room for all of my elements. If I wanted to assign margining to the top, bottom, right, and left, I could do that on 4 separate lines, but there's actually an easier way to do this. You could write all of your margining spacings on one line. And the route that it follows is top, right, bottom, left. So this is how you would write all of your numbers in one line if you wanted to just write your margining on one line. It follows the clock, like top, right, bottom, left. So in our case, we wanted 2% on the top. At the right, we had nothing. And then at the bottom, maybe 1.5%. And at the left, we also had nothing. If we refresh that, it keeps the same. And you can also play around with that to kind of prove that it does exactly what you want. If we were to change this again, it kind of, it's listening to you. It knows exactly what to follow when you write this all in one line. Okay, so that's margining on one of our items, but it still doesn't look that good because our name is pretty close to this end. And I kind of want to move it a little bit more inside so it's just not that close. So something that we could do is I want to first assign a background color to each of these items so that you can kind of see what we're playing with here. Red, blue. So they're kind of within their own spaces, and I really want to give name more room than just this. And what I'm going to do is zoom into this a little bit so you can kind of see what I mean with padding. If I were to assign padding to this, and I want to say padding left, let's give it 5%. You can kind of see within its own element, it gave itself space. If I were to say margin left, instead, what it did is move the object. It gave the object 5% of space away from what was outside of it. So that's kind of the best way to think of it, is padding works within the object, but margining works outside of the object. And maybe it'll even make more sense if I give this a background. Yeah, so you can kind of see margining, it's taking this object and it's moving the entire thing 5% to the left. But if I were to say padding, name would still be within its same thing, but it would move within itself. It's kind of hard to interpret, so it's completely okay if you don't fully understand it. But I do want to give a little bit of padding. I gave 0.5, just the slightest bit, so that it still starts at the same place, but it's within its own div and it just moves a little bit to the left, or to the right actually. So let me go ahead and remove these backgrounds. I hope that made sense for margining and things like that. Another thing that I want to do here before we move on to padding for our body text is I want to play with flex grow. Flex grow is another part of flex. And if we go to grow, yeah, flex grow kind of gives your children whatever growth space you need them to have. So in our case, I think our icons are going to be very small. They're always going to be that size, but your name could be whatever you want. You can make that sentence or string however long you want it to be. And if we had looked earlier when we assigned a background color of red to our name, it didn't have that much space. I would rather it have most of this space here. So in order to do that, you can use flex grow. So we'll go ahead and say flex grow, and we'll say something like 2, just so you can kind of see what I mean. With FlexGrow 2, let me add back the background. You can see that it literally took up 2 of the entire width that was given to it. The math that's being used here is actually it's pretty interesting. It takes 20% of it. You can look into the math much more, but it kind of interprets the entire width that it has for its children. And it's like, okay, if you say take 2 of this width, then I'm going to fill 2 blocks of this width and assign it to this one thing. And with these socials, they kind of have nothing to them. So something that I could do, if I don't want it to be that cramped, maybe I can say, oh, you can flex grow 1. And that gives it a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of space. So you can kind of see how they play together with flex grow. And this allows you to have all of this space for name instead of, if I removed it, it would just have the space that it had before. But with flex grow, it allows it to have even more space. And I could literally put whatever I wanted within this part right here. And it would be just fine. All right, so that's margining and padding for the top. Now I want to do margining and padding for the body so that we can get into pretty fonts and colors. Oh, and I'm going to add flex grow back on, but not just yet because I want to talk about flex end. Okay, so let's add some margining to our body. All right, let's see. Okay. So for our main greeting, we want, let's see, actually, I want to actually show you guys something. Red. Okay, so I think what we're going to do here is I'm going to show you guys margining on the top of our buttons. If we say margin top 5%, that way they're not so close to one another. That gives a little bit of space. That way we can move it around. You kind of see how that space adjusts as the screen goes bigger and smaller. We can also do 10% if we wanted to, even though it's pretty big, but we don't need to do that. I also want to mention something about 60 VW. If I was to make this 100 VW, that literally means 100 view height or viewport height. Your viewport is literally what you're looking at. So like if my viewport was super small, that would be a different way the 100 is being interpreted. If my viewport's being super big, then this is 100% of this viewport or 100% of this viewport height. So when I say 60 viewport height, that's just taking 60% of the viewport height. But yeah, so margining top on our buttons would go right there. And I kind of want to keep it as that for now, I think. And I think right now I want to go into making things actually look pretty. So it looks like our content is where we want it to be. If we go back to our design, we have our name at the top. We have our icons on the right-hand side. Those are going to be changed. And then the body, we have it in the middle and projects, work, and hobbies. Now let's actually make this look how it's supposed to look. For starters, our background is not even white. On Figma, I actually chose to make it a completely different color. Let's see what color I decide to make it. FD, 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 FD. So what I want to do is instead of having a white background, first thing I want to do is change my background color to actually be that background color. So since this is not header content or main content, I'm just going to put it here. I'm going to say body, background color, hashtag, this color. So a few things to note here. One, you can put whatever color you want. Instead of saying, because before I was using blue and red for the colors, but you can use hex codes and you can use RGB codes if you'd like. And another thing, I'm not applying this to a class anymore. I'm applying it to a literal tag. You can do that as well. If you look back at our code, our body holds literally everything on the website. So if you're trying to modify the color of your background, the background being what holds everything on your website, you want to modify the body tag, basically. You can also do this with A tags. And if you guys don't know what that is, that's okay. An ahref tag is basically where you can link something to something else. So if I were to say www.google.com and I were to maybe wrap like this div with that, if I were to refresh this, it would become a hyperlink where I click it, it goes to Google. That's how A tags work. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that because it makes it ugly. But for A tags, I would be able to modify an A tag on its own as well if I wanted to, like A, and then I could do whatever I want. So that's kind of why I'm able to modify body. And I don't know if you can tell, but the background did slightly change to be this FD, 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 blah, blah, blah color. Another thing, on my designs, I have a very specific font that I'm using. I'm just using one on the entire site, and it's called Jost, J-O-S-T. So how am I able to get this beautiful font into my project? Easy way to do this, and the way that I always suggest people do this, especially for hackathon projects, just go to fonts.google.com and import the font that you like the most. You can kind of see, I already did this, but you can search literally any font that you want here. And it provides you the CSS script that you can put into your code that allows it to recognize, okay, this is a font that I can use throughout my entire website. So in our case, I wanted to use Jost, and that's what I ended up selecting. But for even more advice on kind of how to go about this, if I were to choose Roboto, I could click that and it shows me all these different types. And to add it to my cart, sort of, I would just hit select this style and it would show up on the right-hand side. I have Jost already, but if I were to select Roboto, it would show up right there. But I'm going to go ahead and remove that because I have Jost. And then it says use on the web. You can put a link in your HTML or you can import in your CSS. Since it's modifying fonts, I like to put in my CSS. So I'm going to click the import and it literally provides you the import URL that you need to use. So I just copy that. And at the very top, I'm going to give it a little category, fonts. I'm going to say import this. This is a URL that Google Fonts itself generates, so I don't have to worry about how this is being interpreted. I know it's going to be understood. It even tells me exactly how I can use the CSS rule to have my font be used anywhere I want it to. So it says font family, say Jost sans serif. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it. Let's see, let's paste it right in my header name. If I do that and refresh, you can kind of see it does exactly what I want, but I have a very specific one that I'm using in my Figma. I'm not using just a regular one. I'm using, let me see if I can show you. I'm using Light. And if you guys notice here, I installed 3 different ones. I installed Light 300, regular 400, and semi-bold 600. When I just say font family Jsx, it'll take the default. What I wanted to do instead is I'm going to specify the font weight. I'm going to say 300. And now if I go to refresh, we can see that it lightened it just a little bit. That basically means, oh, okay, in your import, you imported 300, 400, and 600. I know you're using the font family Jsx, and I know you want to use the weight 300. That's why it's able to acknowledge that and attribute it to that string. Another thing, there is a lot of spacing between my design on Figma. You can see like the letters are not very close together. There's a little bit of spacing. So what I want to do there is I'm going to say letter spacing. And let's do something like 0.3%. Let's see how that looks. I literally did nothing. Oh, I don't have semicolon. Yeah, that literally did nothing. Let's do 0.3 EM. Okay, that did something. What you did notice though is I used a different unit. So in CSS, you can use multiple different types of units. You can use percentages, you can use EM, you can use REM, you can use PX, that's the most common one. It stands for pixels. But the ones that are the best for responsiveness are the percentages, EM, and REM. There's a lot of math that goes into how CSS is interpreting these units, but it's all in slightly different ways. And I would say play with them a little bit. There's many different ones. Again, percent, REM, or EM, or PX. They're all, the math is interpreted all in different ways. So you kind of be surprised at how it's used. But REM, EM, and percentages are used most for responsive development. This kind of looks a little bit closer to what we intended though. Twitter, Instagram, and GitHub, I know there's going to be socials. Social icons, so I'm not even going to bother with that. Instead, I want to modify the text of my hello world and my projects, work, and hobbies buttons. So it's going to kind of be the same thing. I'm going to copy this font family and the font weight. I'm going to go over to this main greeting. I know that in my designs is extremely heavy. That's because I'm literally using the heaviest one. And I'm going to make it 600. So if I go and save that, I can refresh and see that it does change it. And for my projects, works, and hobbies, kind of looks like it's the same thing. It looks pretty light. Maybe I'll assign regular to that one. So instead of the 600, I'll do the 400 for that. And I can go ahead and say font family, 400, refresh, and you can see that I changed that font as well. Now, another thing, I noticed that on my designs, Hello World is extremely big. I can adjust the text size of my font as well. The way to do that is I would go into my greeting. Oh my God, no, not font size. Yeah, font size. How big that I want it to be. Let's do 1.5 rem. That makes it pretty big. I would rather it be a little bit bigger. 2 rem. Yeah, that doesn't make it look that bad. And if we look at our designs, it looks a little bit closer to exactly how it's supposed to come out. So our CSS is modifying our HTML extremely heavily. And you can see that our HTML has barely changed, but our CSS changed way more. You literally are able to modify anything and everything that you need to in your CSS. It literally controls everything. But the next thing that we want to focus on is getting rid of these icons and getting rid of and making these strings buttons. I'm trying to see which one I have more. I think I'd rather show you guys the icons because in case we run out of time, I want to show you guys the icons. And there's a huge chance that you guys are going to use icons in whatever project you make, especially if you're doing web development. So one of the easiest ways to integrate icons into your project is with Font Awesome. I'm sure you guys already know of this website, but if you don't, it's a very good beginner website. It's a very way to implement icons into your HTML code. I'm going to go ahead and send a link to y'all. Let's see. Oh no, it's on this one. I hate when it does this thing. Send that to you guys. Yeah, it's actually ridiculous how many units are. There's like way too many. And like CM, and there's way too many. Like genuinely, there are way too many. But let's go ahead and look at Font Awesome. Sorry for the. Okay, so with Font Awesome, you can kind of only use it if you have an account. But let me show you how it'll treat you if you don't have an account. So if we say start for free, and in our case, we want a Twitter icon, we want Instagram, we want GitHub. So I'm just going to search for Twitter. Search. And then it's going to load its search page. It's going to say, oh, we have 10 matching results. And I think this one looks pretty good. So I'm going to select that one, supersizing, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to say, okay, start using this icon. So I do want to start using it. And it actually has instructions right here. If you don't have a project set up, you can get started there. So I will go ahead and click get started here. And then you have to put in your email. So you put in your email, and I'll go ahead and do aileen@nighthacks.org. And you can click send. Oh, well, I have to log in because I already have this account. But if I do Aileen, oh, yeah, I already have it. Fill. But what it's going to do when you first start, it's going to send you a kit code. And with that kit code, it sends it straight to your email. So you basically have a kit code to use. What you do with that is you put it right into your head. And again, remember, your head is where you put all your metadata, you put all your scripts, you put all your links. So it gives you this kit code that you literally just put into your head, and that allows your entire project to recognize, oh, I have Font Awesome installed. I can use literally any icon on Font Awesome. So let's see, the kit code that I have, it's a script, and it says, no, source, yes, kit, Font Awesome. .com/ don't steal mine because I'm pretty sure it's attributed to my account. Don't quote me on that though. 12a756.js. Okay, and then cross origin anonymous. This is all dependent on if I spelled any of this right. Also, you won't have to copy and paste yours or write out yours like I did. You would literally be emailed the script and you just be able to copy and paste it. To kind of prove that this works though, let's actually go back and get a Twitter, go back to Twitter and get the code that was attributed to Twitter. It's the first one that came up. So if I select that, it says it's loading. I want to start using it. And it says copy this HTML. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to where I used to have my Twitter, Instagram, and GitHub. And instead of that, I'm just going to delete this. And I'm just going to paste this thing here instead. I'm kind of curious how it looks, so I'm going to refresh. And you can see that it gave me an icon. With this script, it literally is saying, okay, you have access to this font kit with Font Awesome. So you have access to any font that you want. And with this string right here, the I class FAB FA Twitter, this is how Font Awesome provides you HTML for an icon. So if I want to do the same thing for Instagram, I could just type in Instagram. And I'll go with the first one, that's fine. And then it's going to give me the code, start using this icon. I don't know if you guys can tell the pattern yet, but Font Awesome is very boring with how they name their icons, so you could literally guess the next one. But we can see, oh, we've got the Instagram icon as well. And if I want GitHub, I'm just going to go ahead and guess that instead of Instagram, it's GitHub. Refresh. Yeah, and it literally provides me GitHub. So now we're even closer to the UI design that we came up with. Oh, no, that's not Figma. We have our name at the top left-hand side. We've got our icons on the top right-hand side. We have Hello World in the center. And we have buttons, not yet buttons, in the middle of our page. Before we get into the buttons, looking at our icons is a great example of using margining and padding. But instead of just having one ID that's holding all these individual classes, now that I'm holding more than one thing, I would rather change this to be a class. And back in my CSS, I'm going to change socials to be .socials. And I do want to give it some padding. How much should I do? Okay, so let's go ahead and say margin. Oh, wait, yeah, margin auto 2%. This is a great example. Okay, so remember with 4 numbers, if you're using 4 numbers for margin or padding, it goes both ways. The first one is top, second one's right, the third one is bottom, and the left hand is 0. If you're just doing 2 numbers or 2 values, because auto is not a number, it's a value, then the first one would be considered your vertical, and the second one would be considered your horizontal, so you're up and down. So you can kind of, or horizontal is side by side, not up and down. So the first one is vertical, which is up and down, and then the second one is horizontal, which is side by side. So you can kind of see that I did provide it a margin of 2%. It's no longer hugging the right-hand side anymore that much, but I actually want each of my individual icons to still have their own margining and padding between one another. In order to do that, I'm going to need to go into each individual icon and give it its own ID or its own class if I wanted to follow that. So this is a good example of how you can merge classes and IDs into things. These already have classes, but if I want, I could still give it its own ID, and I could say site header social instead of socials. So I can have that ID for one of them, and maybe I'll just attribute it to all three. If I go over to my CSS, then I could say site header social, and I still want to give it some margin between them. For vertical up and down, I don't want anything, so I'm just going to let it be automatically what it is. But for side by side, I do want there to be some space, so maybe I'll say something like 3%. Let's see how that looks. It's a little bit too big. And the reason why it dropped down like that, I would actually ask somebody, do you know why it dropped down like that? But I can't see the chat. So the reason that it dropped down like that is because of how much space it has for itself. If I were to give it flex grow 1, it would have way more room, and it would now be able to give itself all of that margining within its space. But remember the problem that we had with flex grow, if I give it a background again. It did give it all of that space, but what it does is it starts it at the very beginning. I don't want it to start at the beginning. I want it to start at the end. In order to do that, we're going to use flex again. Oh, I just want to assign this a color just so you guys can see the differentiation. One more time, blue, refresh. Okay, so just as a recap, our site header name has flex grow of 2, and our icons have flex grow of 1. What I want to do is I want to say display flex. I want to say justify content flex end. Did that do anything? Yeah, it did. And it puts all of my icons at the very end. Why did that work? The reason that that works is because in Flexbox, when you say justify content, you can say wherever you want your content to begin. So naturally it starts, it's flex start. Naturally it will always start at the left-hand side. But for us, we made content start in the center. We can also make it start at the end, which is exactly what happened here. Our div starts right here, but our icons are all at the end, because in our code, we assigned display flex, and we said justify this content to the end. And it still has a flex grow of 1. The reason why this looks a little bit smaller than the blue is because of this margining too, by the way. We're to remove that. Now it's the same exact margining, so that looks a little bit better. I think I only wanted to be there. Anyway, now we have spacing for everything. I'm going to go ahead and remove this, remove this. We only have 5 minutes, but I kind of want to give you guys a start on how you would be able to implement your buttons. So something that a lot of people talk about in web development is using CSS libraries and frameworks. And one of the most popular ones is Bootstrap. And I used to use Bootstrap all of the time, especially when I was starting off. So literally, if you are stumped for using icons or components or anything like that, Bootstrap is your answer. Just know that there's a million great ones out there, but Bootstrap is a really good beginner one. And I used to use it all of the time. And the reason why it's very highly popular is because it literally has everything you need. Like, no joke, it literally has every component that you can think of. And it's very practical and it's easy to customize. So if I did have a little bit more time, I would fully go into how to use Bootstrap for this. But I do just want to give a brief example. I think I have enough time to install it and show you guys how it looks with bare bones. But if you don't understand Bootstrap, it's basically just a CSS component library. It just has a bunch of components that you can use and implement into your project. It saves you so much time from needing to create something on your own. Theoretically, I could sit here and build an entire button if I wanted to, but things like Bootstrap exist where I don't need to do that. And it literally provides you the code that you need to just create buttons. So first thing that you would do under getting started naturally, not introduction, but well, actually you could, there's multiple ways of installing this. I like doing it the npm.js install way, or you could just literally put in this link thing into your HTML, and you can see that it literally tells you paste this style sheet link into your head, because again, in your head, that's where all of your metadata, all of your links, all of your scripts go. So actually, I'll go ahead and just do this one for ease of access. In head, I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And if we go here, fresh, it does nothing. But what we can do is now we have access to a button. So if I go to buttons, it shows me a bunch of examples of a bunch of different buttons. I'm just going to copy the very first one. And back in my code where I have projects, work, and hobbies, I'm going to delete this. And instead, let me enter, I'm going to paste this button, type button. I'm going to refresh and see what it did. It gave me a button. So you see how helpful this is? It literally adopted the font that I provided to my buttons, but it's basically using the CSS that's provided in Bootstrap itself. If I want to customize this, I can, but all I have to do is just, include a class, or I could theoretically give it its own button, and I could say like primary button or something like that. Or I could go into this class and I could add another class and say primary button, whatever. Like I could do that if I wanted to, and Atom naturally drops down for me, which is fine. But yeah, so basically, I know I'm running out of time and I don't want it to kick me out, but this is essentially how you would use Bootstrap. And you could use literally anything in Bootstrap. It's as simple as using on the download line, you literally just put in the, oh no, not download, introduction. You could use the CSS line, putting it into your head, and you suddenly have access to all of these components that could be very, very beneficial for your project. Even cards are very helpful. You don't want to build an entire card. You could just copy and paste the cards that they have. And what's really helpful is that you can customize all of this. But I'm going to go ahead and stop my share because I know I'm running out of time. Let's see. Let me see if I can. What does the button do though? Okay, so theoretically, the button would actually show, you would click the button and it would go to your projects page. But I definitely did not have time to show you guys routing in HTML. But kind of as a, I wonder if I can show you guys a spoiler, because I am going to be doing a web design and React.js workshop tomorrow, where I'm going to have this entire portfolio in React.js. And I actually made an entire portfolio design of all of these. So I'll go ahead. Oh, it didn't kick you out. But instead of just this one page, I actually had another style page for your projects where it would show the different projects that you were working on, and then potentially another design for your work, like the company that you were at, the position that you did, and like bullet points if you want to kind of like format it like a resume, and then another page for your hobbies, just to kind of show, you know, pictures and things like that. And these could be carousels and stuff. So theoretically, the button right now, it does nothing. But with an A tag, it would actually, you would click it and it would go to whatever page you tell the A tag to take it to. But these buttons on our code, it does nothing right now. But on the finalized code, theoretically, if you were able to get it to work, you could just click this projects button and it would take you to your projects page. And same for work and hobbies and stuff like that. So, oh my God, let me stop sharing. So yeah, I'm sorry if that was like extremely rushed, but that's pretty much all I got for you guys on intro to HTML CSS. I wasn't also able to get to JS with this. Thank you, Avery. But one thing that I did want to recommend if you're trying to get into JS, one thing that's extremely easy to learn and kind of shows you the ropes of how JS interacts with your project is a scroll to top button. So this would have made more sense if we were working on the projects page or the work page, where you have a lot of content, you're scrolling on your screen, and all of a sudden at the very bottom, there's a little arrow that you can click and it will take you all the way back to the top. That's something a lot of websites have, and it's just a little bit of JavaScript. And that's a very easy way to learn how to use JavaScript and integrate it into your project and kind of see how it works. And there's millions of examples of that online. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to go over with you guys today. I do want to shout out Eli for the next workshop. He's doing Intro to React.js, which is extremely helpful, especially for making really cool websites and stuff like that. And I'm also going to be doing a UI UX workshop at 12 a.m. with Figma, which will be 10 times better than this. Like, it will not be rushed, and you guys will be able to play with Figma with me, and we'll be able to make some really cool stuff. So yeah, if you have any more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, but I don't want to interrupt you guys from hacking, so feel free to keep working on your project if you have one. You're welcome, Ruth. And yeah, ask me any questions you've got. I'll be hovering around in Discord, and I'll be on Hopin once again in like 30 minutes. What's your process designing a front end? That's a great question. Come to my UI UX workshop, because I'm literally going to explain the entirety of how you design to implement into a front end. Would implementing an on action commands for the button be in JS? Actually, They don't need to be, because you can, with an A tag, you can reference anything. So an A tag is basically what I can wrap anything around, and I can say, okay, go to this link that I give you. If I tell it to go to Google, it will go to Google. But you can actually make an action on a button on click. You can make it go somewhere in JavaScript. But it's not difficult to do it in CSS, and it's pretty common to do it in CSS. But yeah, you can definitely do it in JS if you wanted to.